Hello everyone, Sidewin here. Today I'm going to be continuing my party composition series for Pathfinder 2nd Edition, focusing on how you can fill the roles I mentioned. This video is specifically about filling the tank role, because it's one of those roles that you can do it a lot of different ways, but in general, it's a role that has a lot of secondaries. So I thought it would be good to start with it because you can secondarily fill other stuff with the same classes. A quick notice here, this video is focusing on options which are accessible to new players. So I'm not going to be mentioning all the options. Like, for instance, I was browsing around AON and I could potentially see like something with an Animist or an Oracle or another super complex class, but I wouldn't exactly want to hand that to a new player. So, yeah, I'm going to be skipping over those, but I will be covering most of the major ones. So, I'm going to be starting with martial options. This is kind of, well, sort of the martial options. It's all of the classes involved aren't exactly your grounded martials, which you might see in some media. One of them can be, but the other two are distinctively magic associated out of the three primary ones. And then some of the secondaries are also magic related. So it's kind of a reflection of Pathfinder being a high fantasy system. But that's something to be aware of here. So I'm going to be starting with the primary tank options. These are characters which work very well for being your main tank in the party, although they still usually function best alongside a second melee character, usually a damage dealer. So the primary ones are Champion, Monk, and Fighter. These are all extremely accessible classes for new players. Not necessarily the simplest classes in the game, but they're among the at least 7 simplest. So, I'll walk through a little bit about why each one can work and what you need to do to make it work. So the Champion is really like almost any option you pick will function as a tank and will be effective at being a tank. It is recommended that you use a shield if you're going for tank options, but the reason that the Champion works like this is quite simply they gain a lot of armor proficiency, so they will have a very high AC. And many of their feats and abilities give damage reduction abilities for themselves or their allies. And the allies thing is a very important thing to note with tanks because ideally you're trying to make it so that the damage across the party is reduced. Less so about just taking it all yourself, because even a tank will frequently be hit by the bots and will frequently take large amounts of damage. So damage reduction is a key thing to watch for. One note with the Champion is they must follow code of behavior because their powers are mostly derived from an oath, and frequently with Pathfinder they're also associated with a deity. So you will have edicts, anathemas, etc. It's a divine class. And as such, it's not exactly the most grounded in terms of fantasy. For that, you want the Fighter, which I have it at the end here, but I'm going to skip over there. Basically, the main thing you can do as a fighter to function as a good tank is you use a shield. You can technically use just a shield and no melee weapon, but I advise using a one-handed melee weapon and a shield. Preferably that one-handed melee weapon has some traits on it which can benefit you in fulfilling your secondary role. Because the fighter almost always, whenever they're acting as a tank, also acts as damage. But if you select your weapon carefully, you can also provide support with athletics. Or you can invest in charisma for intimidation. So basically, it's a hybrid character. And now we'll go back to the Monk. The Monk is one of those classes that I'm not super familiar with, but which I know is very effective at being a tank. So the way it works is usually the Monk just has very high base AC, unarmored. You do not need armor as a Monk, whereas a Champion and a Fighter will usually want to be using somewhere between medium and heavy armor, usually on the heavy armor side, so that you're investing less in dexterity. The monk, meanwhile, will invest mostly in dexterity or maybe mostly in strength. It depends on whether they're using mountain stance or not. And they will have really, really high AC. And always, the monk functions as a secondary damage dealer or support. There's really two ways to go being a monk when you're playing a tank. You can go with mountain stance, where you stay more so in one position and hold down an area, or you can go with other stances, where you move around the battlefield and function more so as support. That gives you your secondary role. In general, you choose that based off party composition. For instance, you do not necessarily want to be a mountain stance monk in melee if you're the only melee character, because you can move a bit less than some other characters, and you don't want to be taking the full brunt of attacks as any character. But it can be useful for sealing off areas, just like the champion and fighter can do quite effectively with their shield and a couple of feats. There is a quick note for both monk and fighter that I just want to give before moving on. Both of the classes have no subclasses, and you have a very large number of feats to select from. So it can feel intimidating to build, but generally, my advice for handling that is if you're playing a fighter, look for the feats that use a shield and take them. That will give you an effective character that will function as a tank. For the monk, you generally just have to go through them, but you can find a lot of guides online. Again, I'm not super familiar with the class. One more thing here I'm going to mention for the tank options that are martials are really, these are more secondary tanks and less beginner friendly, but they both technically can pull some of it. One of it is the Inventor with the armor innovation, sort of like a fantasy Iron Man. There's a lot of damage reduction abilities built into the innovation, and there's base damage dealing in the class. And then there's the Exemplar. But I'm not super familiar with either of these. Again, the Exemplar is quite new, and the Inventor is, in general, with my group, not a popular pick. But I will say you can check these out. They're just not super friendly to beginners. So really, if you can get what you want with one of the free classes mentioned prior, I would suggest taking one of those. Now, at this point, I've mentioned martial options, but I've had a lot of new players who are like, I don't want to play a martial, I want to play a caster. And there is one note I'll give here with the tank role. Mostly for casters, they're not ideal primary tanks. And they're more difficult to play because you have the timed abilities or the spell slots. It depends. And the reason I put caster in quotes here is really, I'm kind of grouping a couple of classes that play like casters in here, but are not technically casters. It's a little bit complicated. But really, what I'm saying here is if you're doing this, you generally want a second off-tank martial, also in melee, so that you can split the damage and work together, because most of these options are support. So the free options I'm going to be highlighting here are an option for Cleric, for Kineticist, and for Magus. So the first one is Cleric. This is the only completely straight caster in this list. And the way you do it is quite simply you pick the War Priest subclass. It's not very complicated to do. You just pick it and you wear armor. Ideally, you want a second melee character so that you can send out all your buffs and improve them, while also being able to fight yourself. And it's the simplest option in this list. Once you've picked War Priest, you really can't make it so that you're not a tank, except for by intentionally not taking a shield. The shield and War Priest are the only things you need to do. And then you just pick whatever spells appeal. And you will have a bit of tankiness, but again, it's not a primary tank. The second one I'm going to mention is Kineticist. And the way Kineticist works is basically you control the elements, and you can select what elements you can control. Very frequently, you will pick 2 or more elements, but occasionally you'll pick just one and have additional benefits when using your abilities. They are not spell slot dependent. That's the main reason they're on this list. Their abilities are infinite use, they just have recharge times. So the way that Kineticist works is it is a hybrid class. So you generally don't just fill one role whenever you're playing a Kineticist, you typically have 2 roles. And your build choices determine what those 2 roles are. So typically the Kineticist will be a support X another role, which is either damage or tank. And sometimes they'll be just support, but all of it's up to your build choices. So the primary options for if you want a tanky Kineticist are wood, metal, and earth elements. All 3 have options for fulfilling the tank role with damage reduction and armor abilities. And they're all fairly straightforward to pick up those abilities. Like with wood, for instance, you can go with hardwood armor and protector tree to reduce damage taken, or you could go with the fresh produce healing spell and protector tree. It's just a mix and match thing. The secondary options for the Kineticist who wants to have some tank are water and air. Both of these are not quite as much of a tank as those in the first list, but pairing one in the primary options with one in the secondary options can create a fairly effective Kineticist with a mix of abilities. There's one element which I do not recommend taking if you are planning to be focused on doing tanky stuff, unless you're wanting to have a very, very strong damage focus, and that is fire, because the fire element is almost all damage spells, with a couple of support and no really tank options. So if you're looking for a straightforward way to do it, I would recommend single element wood, because it gives you the support abilities and the tank, and you still have the bit of damage regardless. The last option on this list is one which I'm not really sure if it works super well, but I'm pretty sure it should function as an off tank. That is the Magus with the Sparkling Targe subclass, and that last bit's very important. By default, the Magus is a glass cannon, and it's also very, very action intensive for dealing damage. But the Sparkling Targe gives a couple of more defensive options, which can let him survive a bit more, and it also gives a lot of damage reduction options, especially when paired with a couple of spells. To play a Sparkling Targe, you have to use a shield. That's specifically what Sparkling Targe uses. It's a shield and a one-handed weapon. And out of this list, it's the most complex option. But if you really want to be primary damage with just a little bit of tankiness, the Sparkling Targe can work. I just wouldn't advise it for your very first time playing Pathfinder. Thank you for watching this video. If you have any questions on any of this, I am free to answer them in the comments. Thank you for watching.